you don't actually care about me. Because if that scoreboard isn't green, it doesn't matter who I am, what I'm about, what I bring to the table. There are things that we're doing to the customer that aren't customer friendly. Again, all in sake of this goal.
I would argue that the current benchmarks are not conducive to sustainable growth. Saying that, sure, we have 80% turnover, but the industry is 85, so we're good, I don't think is a solid, sustainable business practice. Apologies in advance if I get medication wonky or just sound annoying and nasally. Metrics that matter. What corporate retail leaders need to hear about measuring success where it counts. The goal of this episode is to tackle the fundamental challenge in retail, the gap between what we measure and what actually matters. And of course, while data and metrics are essential tools for business success, the retail industry, I would argue a lot of industries, often fall into the trap of hitting the target but missing the point. Achieving metric targets become disconnected from sustainable business health and customer satisfaction. So why is it critical for corporate leaders to hear this? I think that current metrics often drive unintended behaviors. I think store teams are often caught between satisfying metrics and serving customers effectively. And I think that important aspects of retail success often go unmeasured or undervalued. And I think a lot of these things after talking to you. My hope for this episode is that we can move beyond just criticizing the current metrics and explore how we might better measure what actually matters in retail: customer satisfaction, team engagement, and sustainable business growth. So I think we both really want listeners to walk away with practical ideas for evolving their approach to performance measurement, whether they're setting the metrics or the ones working to achieve them. That said, maybe an apt place to start is a brief acknowledgement of why metrics exist and their importance. I don't think either of us are anti-metric.
Not at all. You mean lots of data.
Obviously, we can all agree that metrics provide an objective and quantifiable way to measure and track performance. They allow organizations to gain valuable insights into their operations, make informed decisions based on that data rather than intuition alone. But sometimes it seems like human intuition has been removed entirely, and all business decisions are being made based on metrics alone. So I think that sets up the fundamental question: what are we actually trying to achieve in retail? What are the metrics metricing? What are we measuring?
Oh, am I supposed to answer that?
I can go first if you want. I have a quick note. To me, I think the crux of it all is like business growth, right? And we can get into the details of what that is. But I would say that means more money via more market share or more lifetime value. And I think that happens via customer satisfaction. I think what makes that sustainable is a more complex question. Spoiler alert, I'm going to say it's team engagement. Any thoughts on that? Anything missing? Agree that's the goal of retail?
Yeah, I think that's the overall goal, especially because, and we'll get more into it in the episode, I would say like comp is like the number one thing that people are measuring. And that is just basically what you said: growth, more market share.
Cool. So what are the standard metrics that you've been measured against in different retail roles?
Sure. I think there's 4 or 5 really standard across the board ones that everyone has. And that's essentially your comp percentage, so your year-over-year sales growth, conversion, so how many customers are purchasing versus how many are walking through the door, the average sale or average basket, depending on where you work, and then units per transaction or items per transaction, which obviously relates to average sale but isn't the same. And then some retailers focus on the average item sale, like what is the average item worth? And then there's credit card acquisition. And now with the influx of what we call like omni-channel into stores, it's often a buy online, pick up in store, so a BOPIS fulfillment rate. If you have a ship from store where you're fulfilling online orders and shipping to customers, there could be a ship from store fulfillment rate. And that's essentially saying, I got 100 BOPIS orders today. I was able to fill 92. So I have a 92% BOPIS fulfillment rate. And to quickly add in there to what we started talking about, I've also seen where that affects customer service, because when BOPIS first launched in one of the retailers I worked in, they were like, basically never not accept an order. Like fulfill it first, basically to get your fulfillment there. So if a customer calls before you fulfilled it, basically fulfill it and then return it. Don't cancel it, because that will affect your thing. If you cancel it, their card isn't charged. The pending charge leaves, right? But if I fulfill it, I'm charging their card and then I'm returning money to their card. And that always didn't sit well with me either. So there are things that we're doing to the customer that aren't customer friendly. Again, all in sake of this goal. But yeah, anyway, those are the main metrics of retail at the moment. And then, of course, some companies have 20 more because there's all sorts of other things they're chasing.
Which one of these, if any, do any of them seem most disconnected from actual store success?
So here's where it's going to get a little hairy, I think. I actually, so this question, I think there's no metric actually that's disconnected from store success. I think almost every metric I've been asked or they've measured and I've asked to achieve the goal does contribute to store success in some way. I think the disconnect is actually what happens when you don't hit the goal. That is where the issue really lies. Not necessarily that we're chasing things that don't matter, but we're chasing some things that maybe don't have equal weight. So when we don't hit them, the conversation should be very different. So if I'm comping 10% and then my BOPUS fulfillment rate is 75, that should be a tiny conversation. It shouldn't be equal to me not comping. So that's where my mindset shift is.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can you say more about where the disconnect is, what happens when you don't reach it? So you get in trouble, like everything is weighted equally. You don't get asked why one metric suffered.
I wouldn't say get in trouble, but I think there's the perception that you're in trouble, which for most retail leaders I've found amongst people is the same. And so, because if someone's asking you why, even and digging deep, in some company cultures that feels like trouble because you're like, oh God, they're paying attention to me or they're digging in deeper. It doesn't necessarily mean trouble, but a lot of times it could be an email or maybe it's just a conversation. I think in one of the healthiest places I've worked, there was a good striation of focus across the metrics. And let's say you were hitting the most important ones, like comp and whatever their other one was. If you weren't hitting something like BOPUS, they'd just be like, hey, what's this about? And you'd be like, oh, I think our inventory's off because we had this issue, but we're working with inventory to fulfillment to fix it. And then they'd be like, oh, okay, no worries. And that was the conversation. And then there are other places where you'll get like, you're not in trouble, but you'll get the lecture on how important it is to fulfill this and show up for the customer. And if BOPUSs aren't fulfilled, then they might come to the store before it's fulfilled. And now you have a disappointed customer in your store. Also, we all know that. We don't need that lecture. And that is a extremely low BOPUS fulfillment rate, just so we're all clear, because BOPUS is like one of those things you want to be in like points, not whole percentages down. But anyway, we all know those things, but it's like people don't want the lecture. And I feel like a lot of times people are achieving metrics to escape the lecture, not necessarily trouble, but the lecture.
So have you seen examples where chasing metrics led to worse outcomes?
I think even some of the top line metrics like conversion, trying to get every customer or not every customer, but a higher percentage of customers to make a purchase can lead to some aggressive sales and bothering customers who, quite frankly, don't want to be bothered. And then in that same vein, you could actually be losing average sale in that moment while you're bothering the customer who doesn't want to be bothered because you're chasing conversion. There's a customer on the other side of the store who has $100 worth of stuff in their basket, and it could be 150 if they were just getting the proper help. But you're too stretched thin because you're trying to like make everyone's experience the same. So I think when companies push a certain metric, it can lead to a worse outcome either overall or just in another metric falling. And then you're just playing the balancing plates game.
Interesting. So how do you handle it when corporate metrics conflict with what you feel is right for your store?
So how do I handle it?
I'm
I
excited.
care less about that than a lot of retail leaders, only because, not because I don't care about getting in trouble or that I want lectures or any of that. I have a very long-term view of things. And so I try not to let short-term results knock me off my path to the long-term goal. And I think, to put it more succinctly, when it comes to corporate, I'm willing to let corporate think that I'm a bad leader in the short term for them to know I'm a great leader in the long term. And that is not an equation a lot of people are comfortable with. But my fear has always been, because I've seen it, if I want them to think I'm great in the short term and chase all of the things they want me to chase, I can often lose the long-term vision. And then in the long term, they're like, wait, you started so strong and now your store is falling apart. What happened? And it's not that people's store falls apart. It's that they were so focused on that, say, day-to-day conversion or the day-to-day comp. In 6 months or a year and a half, their team's falling apart. They have high turnover. All the other things are falling apart. And once your team starts falling apart, there's no metric that you can achieve.
I feel like this is very connected to our empowerment episode, which
Yeah.
we should definitely link to.
I mean, it's all correlated.
Yeah. So it sounds like metrics become a problem when they are viewed in a vacuum, without context, without nuance, without talking to your store leaders. So let's talk a little bit about that, like the hidden cost of a hypermetric focused corporate leaders. I'm just curious, how do metrics impact your team's day to day behavior? And this can be high level, this can be specifics, anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think just on a high level, it creates a tension sometimes. What the company says their goal or mission is, and then what we're actually being held to. So if you say we're people first or we're customer first, and the team feels like they need to let a metric be terrible, or not even terrible, mediocre, to better service a customer, they feel that tension. And they might not always have the words to describe it, but they definitely feel that, well, wait, you said the customer was first, but now I have to do this thing that's actually not going to help the customer. So I think it creates just a lot of not only indecisiveness, but it creates an environment in stores where people second guess their own knowledge in what to do next.
And I imagine that's really stressful, showing up and doing what you feel and know is right for your store, but simultaneously just becoming anxious that your bosses, in some way, that leaders who have so much to do with your day to day, are disagreeing with your decision, even though they're not there.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't situation.
Yes. I mean, that is how some people feel.
Yeah.
And I think especially people feel that way when they don't, again, to like link back a little, feel empowered to speak up and be like, here's the situation I'm in. Because if you don't have that platform and then you feel that tension, you're probably going to be just either riddled with anxiety or doubt. And then you'll do the thing that's worse than doing the wrong thing sometimes, which is you'll do nothing.
Is there a bigger picture psychological impact of this constant metric tracking on store teams that you've noticed?
I think, especially in the last 5 years, companies have pushed a lot this idea that we like care about our teams and care about who you are as people. And some of that's them trying to sort of champion their diversity initiatives. Some of that's just them trying to prove that they care about their people just in general. I think what this does long term is it really makes teams go, well, you don't actually care about me. Because if that scoreboard isn't green, it doesn't matter who I am, what I'm about, what I bring to the table.
Right.
I'm not good enough. And what I think or want or need doesn't matter anymore. And I'm realizing this as I say this out loud. That's been my hidden agenda throughout my career, which is I'm just going to get that board green so someone will listen to my ideas, because I've learned that once it's green, people will listen. And if it's not green, people are like, well, of course you're complaining or think something could be better. You're red.
Wow. I just have to go back. I can't not address this. You said companies have pushed this idea that they're people focused. It doesn't sound like you believed a lot of them. So this idea feels like it's being pushed upon you rather than you feeling like it.
Yeah, and because it's a what's a phrase on the break room poster board. It's not lived day to day in the store. There's no teams need to feel like it, and managers have a big role in that, obviously, but from a corporate down, it's hard for corporate, I think, to prove that they really care about and want to know the diversity of their team. And when I say diversity, I don't just mean all of the obvious ways we should care about diversity. I also mean diversity of personality, of thought. And companies do very little to sort of really embrace those differences.
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on your opinion, quite frankly, on that actually reflect customer experience. And in another way, and put another way, what metrics do you wish corporate paid more attention to?
Turnover. I really wish they paid more attention to employee retention as a metric. And I think if every company put their focus there, if that was equal to comp, a lot of other things would change or have to fall in place, because they'd have no other choice. Because listen, I've worked in places that have relatively high turnover, just like the nature of the business. And to keep your scorecard green while having that turnover, it's possible. It will kill you a little bit inside, but it's possible. But if companies were paying attention to turnover and then not just blaming that solely on the manager in the store, we could really get somewhere in terms of progress and all the other metrics more consistently.
Can you say more? Why is turnover such a problem for you? I mean, I agree. I'm on board. But what happens in your store when turnover is high?
You enter a world where now you have to retrain and reteach some things, and you've lost some knowledge that teams have built over time. And I think if you're in a like a retail environment, there's certain patterns to the business.
Mhm.
And so if you're going into, say, the most obvious Christmas season, 75% of your team is tenured that have been through at least one other Christmas, if not multiple. That
Mm,
Christmas is so much easier because you don't need to explicitly tell them everything that needs to happen to prep for a successful not only season but each individual day. They know what a Black Friday at your business looks like. They know what the recovery from that looks like and what good and bad looks like. If your team is 75% new, who boy. So it's not only hurting all the metrics, it's hurting the manager's ability to be rested and focused and actually continue to be a good leader.
yeah. And I think it's widely known that manager burnout is a massive problem right now. So it sounds like turnover is a huge contributor to that.
Yes.
Fewer people that you can rely on. Yeah. So would you say that turnover is a leading indicator of customer experience?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's like a red flag. If you see your turnover skyrocketing, expect your customer experience or your brand sentiment to follow
Exactly.
up in a perverse trajectory.
Yes.
Okay. So we promised that we would try not to just criticize current metrics, that we would try to get into offer suggestions for what really matters, what both store leaders and corporate leaders might be able to do differently to see more compatible goals. This is a I feel like this is a big question. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on the true indicators of store health. So how would you personally gauge if your store is healthy?
Loaded question. I think I've said this to you before because it's been my mantra for at least a decade, which is I have three order of priorities, which is number one are my employees, number two are my customers, and number three are the company or my boss. And I think for me, measuring store health is first looking at my employees. Like if my employees aren't happy and engaged, I don't
Mhm.
actually care about the other things because I can't sustainably achieve them. I can achieve them, but not sustainably. And that's like important to me because again, I'm thinking about the long term. And then once my employees are engaged and happy, the second thing is like, are the customers getting a good experience? Happy employees help the customer experience. They don't always just naturally equal it because there's
Mhm.
obviously maybe your employees love each other too much and they're only talking to themselves. So then I'm looking at are the customers getting a good experience? And if those two things are true, 9.9 times out of 10, all the rest falls into place. The comp is there. I have low turnover. The company's happy. Everyone leaves me alone. No lectures to be had. But yeah, so for me, it's the true indicator of store health is first like to really bastardize what I'm saying is like, what are the vibes? Are the vibes good?
Yeah.
Put it really simply. Because if the vibes aren't good, store health can't be measured by a scorecard.
Yeah. So I appreciate that because I think what we're approaching here is that not all important things can be measured. Right?
Correct.
There's not a number score that you can give something. And just because that's the case, it doesn't mean it's not important. I think that often means why it's avoided because people have a hard time quantifying it. But I think anecdotal or qualitative feedback, maybe they're not official metrics, but is critical. Follow up question, Matthew. What are your metrics for vibes? How do you measure if your team is happy?
So for me, two of the things are compassion and grace. And what I mean by that, I've said that to so many employees that I'm sure some of the ones listening are like rolling their eyes at me. What I mean by that is when one of their peers makes a mistake or is performing badly, they respond. And to me, a good store culture is they're not going to be like, oh, well, of course, Bianca messed that up. What's new? They're
Right.
going to be like, wow, Bianca must be having a really tough day today. I wonder if I could help. Or even better, sometimes I would prefer if a team member was like, why did Matt ask Bianca to do that? She hates doing it. He knows that. I love doing it. Let me go do it. Bianca can do what I'm doing. She'd prefer that anyway. To me, a
Mhm.
good culture is a team that knows each other and then there's compassion and grace for them as people.
Yeah.
That's super important to me. I have not always successfully built an environment where that has been possible. I need to say that off the front because I I know there are some people listening who know that's true and I want to admit that. And I've in some places I've killed myself trying. It's not easy. And this is going to sound like a plug, but it's not. It's actually easier sometimes in places, or actually, I would say almost all the time, that are more diverse. But people who are from the same background, the same group, it's actually sometimes harder to get them to not be cliquey or judgmental of each other. Because the thing is, I'll just use age as an example. I think it's a great example. I love age diversity. I think it's super important in the workplace and retail because your customers are going to be all ages.
Right.
A 70-year-old is not typically going to look at a 22-year-old and be like, what an idiot. There's going to be some like, and vice versa. Like they just won't. Whereas maybe two 22-year-olds are going to, there's a little bit more competition that can sometimes be unhealthy. So my long answer is that really
Mhm.
compassion and grace and building to that. And if I've built that, all the success will come. And how I can gauge that though, there is one, it's not measurable necessarily, but it's a word I can hear. And I didn't realize this. A peer recently of mine, I'm going to give him credit because he said it and I like wrote it. I literally wrote it down because I was like, that's, you don't even realize you're a genius, but you are. So shout out to Semi. But we were talking and he said, I know when people have fully bought into the culture when they start using the word we. And I literally was like, hold on, let me write that down because I think that's so true. If you start hearing, especially again, when mistakes are made or like a customer comes in and is disappointed with something, they're not like, oh, well, that was Sarah. Of course, Sarah did your return wrong. It's more like, I'm so sorry we did that, but we're happy to fix it. When they start using we, you're like, okay, you're in it. We're a team, we're part of a culture. So I think that hearing that word is a great measurement.
Oof, that's a lot. That I think that just beautifully said, all of it. The idea of compassion and grace being an indicator of store culture. It's actually something I've never heard before. And I've read a lot of Simon Sinek.
I have been repeating this for years.
Yeah.
I'm going to admit this publicly and I'm going to later regret it and that's okay. But the best team I've ever had was the first store I ever ran. And I have been on a mission in my career to basically replicate that. And it's not that I haven't had success or had these things, but
Yeah.
that team was uniquely compassionate and full of grace. And it's actually what I mean, I obviously helped create it and curate it through hiring and the way I treated my team. I also came from somewhere that I wasn't treated very well. So I was very much living the be the leader you wish you had mentality in a way that I maybe never did again, unfortunately. But that really taught me, I'm like, oh, this is the key. Watching them interact and be there for each other and allow each other to make mistakes and grow
Yeah.
was one really beautiful and two really I remember like thinking about it later and being like that's why we were so good. That's why we were number 1 in everything because no mistake really held us back. Someone else filled the gap like naturally. I didn't even need to orchestrate it. It was just like, "Oh, Dan doesn't like that." And I like, "Let's switch roles." And yeah, I think that is really the key.
Why was that possible there?
That's a loaded question. I think a big piece of it is I definitely personally had something to prove. It was the time I'm actually trying to get back to this. After my 6-month break in retail, my husband actually said to me, he was like, "Ooh, this is," and he said the company's name. This is the blank version of you. And I was like, "Oh, yes, that's what we're trying to get back to," because I was so personally, so full of hope.
Mhm.
And I was like, I had come from so many jobs where I wasn't a store leader, where I couldn't control the environment. And I was like, I am going to prove that treating people right works. If I have to kill and I even, one of the employees who I still speak to, shout out to Michael, and this was 14 years ago, oh my God. He once said to me, I actually cried the night when I went home because I was so upset. He was like, if I was the manager, I would never let them do that. And it was like, he wasn't trying to be a jerk, but I left and was like, I had this moment of doubt. And unlike a lot of other times in my career, I didn't let that doubt sneak in. And I just kept being like, this is going to work. This has to work because if this, not to like put too fine a point on it, but in my head, I was like, if this doesn't work, I don't like know what I really believe about humans. This
Right.
has to be possible. And so I was really convinced that if I just led in a way that I was full of compassion and allowed people to make mistakes, that would eventually repeat itself. And I would slowly weed out the people who couldn't do that or didn't want to do that because there are people who are like I don't want to like people and it was a process and it was long and it was awful and some of the worst moments of my personal life were in there as I like left work and was like frustrated. But I think a big reason why that was possible is it really started with me And I think one of the reasons I struggled to replicate it in my career, two reasons, we're admitting this out loud on a podcast, oh boy. One is just I let different pieces of my career slowly jade me away from this mentality. And then two, there was an ego component, I think, of I have done the best thing ever and I can do the best thing ever again. But I don't think I ever put in that same full body effort, passion, excitement into it, which is why I could never get it again.
You suspended disbelief.
Yes. And I'm back to that. I'm definitely back to that. I needed a break. I needed to rest. We need to have an episode on burnout at some point, but
Yeah.
I really needed to pull back and re-find my that is the way. And I need to hold strong. That is the way. And when small things, like an employee who can't do those things gets in the way, I can't adjust my vision and be like, oh, well, maybe I do need to go beat Sally. You're right. Sally needs to be beaten. Because that's what sometimes people want until it's proven to them as well. Because I like to think that team also learned in that moment that it was possible.
Yeah.
And some of them, like Mike, he didn't think it was possible. That store, he basically told me as much. Like, wow, we did this. Because he thought that employees needed to be punished and yelled at, and there needed to be harsh consequences for certain things. And I just didn't.
Yeah. So you led the store and you modeled compassion and empathy, and your team had compassion and empathy for each other. Corporate minds will want to know, how was the financial performance of that store?
So I'm trying to think of, I can't remember how many stores there were. There were only 5 in the Boston area. I was number 1 for over a year in comp percentage, double-digit comp. We had a sales contest for the holiday. We were number 1 in the entire company. And I remember, and this is related, I remember them asking me, they came on a visit and they were like, what did you do? So everyone got individual goals and then you held them accountable to those individual goals. And I said, no, I don't believe in individual goals. And they were like, what? And I was like, we had team goals. This was the goal for the day. And they were like, but how did you achieve it? And I'm like, I need to give away what the business was. Not that I can't at all. It was Pete's Coffee, and it was like a holiday blend selling contest. And I said, well, I have 3 employees who are really passionate about it and sell it really well at the counter. So every time someone comes up to the counter to buy beans and not an actual beverage, one of those 3 people goes over to them and tries to work their magic. Whoever was there fills in their role because they know that those people are better at it than they are. And they don't mind doing the other task for the financial or for just the betterment of the goal. Plus, I did actually, I can't believe I said this to a team. I still think about this to this day. I had a holiday meeting, and before the holiday meeting, I said, we have to be number 1. And I remember saying this so vividly. I said, we don't have to be number 1 because I want to look good. It actually matters that we're number 1. We need to be number 1 so that we can prove that it's possible for a team to be number 1 and for no one to be written up or punished in the process of running a store. That was my carrot that I gave them. And it worked. Yeah.
I love this story. It sounds like you've had a lot of experience where you've wanted to bring the same culture back to different stores, to different companies, but maybe your direct or corporate leaders got in the way. So what allowed you to do this in terms of your DM or your corporate retail leaders?
This is a funny answer, actually. The DM who hired me there left, and I went 6 months without a DM. And I hate that this is my answer, but it proves my point anyway. And when I got a DM, basically they were like, wow, you've made so much improvement. I remember saying this out loud. I'm like reliving this in real time. It's very odd. But they asked me, like, other stores didn't do as well when they didn't have a DM. How did you get here? And I said, well, I was allowed to do whatever. And if it didn't work, I just stopped doing it. And if it did work, I just kept going in that direction. So I was just allowed the space to make mistakes without a lecture or punishment or being told that wasn't the way we do things or whatever. And because I had like free reign, and again, I had something to prove. I think that's really important in this. We really achieved something. I think that had my boss never quit or I got a new boss right away, I can't say that I would have gotten there. And to answer what I feel like is potentially going to be your follow-up question, what has gotten in my way in other companies? Some of it's been me, like I said, it's been ego, and then it's also been that jaded. But the other thing that's gotten in the way that actually led me to be a little jaded is that there isn't a trust that is going to work. Because it's so very rarely seen as working. But what they know works, what a lot of people, or no, I'm going to put that in quotes, know works is this like, for every mistake, there's a coaching conversation or a lecture or a write up, and there's a documentation process. And I'm not saying that those don't all have a place. I remember going on an interview once where basically I admitted that I don't believe in such things. And they were like, how do you hold people accountable? And I said, accountability isn't punishment. And that really stumped the interviewer. Like, that's been something that's gotten in the way, is allowing, and I think to give the corporate side a little bit of, to put myself in their shoes. There's a lot that could go wrong with what I'm saying.
Sure.
There's a ton that could go wrong. You could end up in so much like legality issues in terms of then who are you giving to a write up to, and when do you decide? If you're being more graceful and allowing people to grow, it's a very precarious situation, especially if you have an employee who really does need to go and they're not capable of change, but you can't only hold them accountable because that's not fair. And I'll be honest and say one of my methodologies, it has not always worked. I am first to admit this. I've actually had to apologize to some teams for allowing someone rotten to the core to stay longer than they deserve. Is one of my methodologies that has worked, I would say 80% of the time, is just creating a culture so good that the people who are bad know that it's their time to go because they don't fit in anymore. It doesn't always work, but it works a lot of the time.
Wow. Okay. I know it might feel like we went on a bit of a tangent about culture, and this is an episode about metrics, but I think that's by design in a way. Because I think the point of this is we're talking about what really matters, and not all the things that really matters, even to the bottom line, can be quantifiably measured. I might even argue that the most important ones aren't quantifiable.
I think that the ones that are quantifiable can be a direct reflection of the ones that aren't, if you're looking at reports correctly and asking the right questions.
So let's talk about reports and the right questions. My question for you that you can think about is, does corporate have any metrics for culture? And I think I want to just preface that from my experience working with corporate retail leaders in various corporate retail departments. The most common feedback from stores about employee experience in stores comes from an annual employee engagement survey.
That was going to be my answer. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I see two major problems with that. And then I'm curious to see if you agree or if you see more. The one major problem is that once a year is way too long a feedback loop to serve survey takers in an industry where turnover is like 70 to 90%. That means 70 to 90% of the people who told you something will be gone by the next time you ask those same questions. So you have no idea if your efforts did anything because you're starting with almost an entirely new batch. I'm sure some stores have better or worse turnover. But also, another big problem that I see is that scores are typically rated compared to industry benchmarks. And I think retail as an industry is not doing well on the employee engagement front. And so I would argue that the current benchmarks are not conducive to sustainable growth. Saying that, sure, we have 80% turnover, but the industry is 85, so we're good, I don't think is a solid, sustainable business practice.
Yeah. To your point, I think it's not frequent enough for sure. I think if we want to measure it in a way, companies have a couple of struggles though, having been on the ground in multiple rounds of these surveys, getting people to, so I'd like to think, this is like a little bit me being full of myself in a way, but I'd like to think that if anyone's team was going to be 100% honest on those surveys, it would be mine. I tend to foster maybe an environment that's too honest sometimes. And even in that environment, it's hard to get people to really be honest because they're either afraid that it's not really anonymous, or if they like their manager, maybe they're worried about getting their manager in trouble because they think it's going to be a reflection of them. So there's a lot of facets in how it's even doled out to the team, how it's explained. I also think just getting everyone to do it. So a lot of companies now are like, basically, you must give your team 15 minutes off the floor to do it.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I think it's an issue to be like, okay, now go back to the computer, and depending on the company, maybe you're not in a private area, and answer all of these questions super thoroughly, but also quickly, because I need you back on the floor. So there's a lot of problems with the application of the survey itself. I don't have all the answers to that right in this podcast, obviously. I wish I did, but I do think that is something to think about and mull over. I still think the surveys can give you some good jumping off points, at least a snapshot in time. But But yeah, I think a more frequent one, at least once a quarter, I think would be
Mm.
much more helpful. And I think then you could actually really start to tie the two together. Because if you had a quarterly survey,
Yeah.
you obviously have a quarterly P&L, performance report or scorecard or however the company works, you'd be able
Mhm.
to really start to see the patterns of
Right.
which employee sentiment and which employee issues relate to good and bad quantitative performance.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about building better measures. What I'm hearing here is we need to balance quantitative and qualitative measures. What are some practical steps to do this? And maybe I should say, if you could design the perfect scorecard for store success, what would it include?
I think this is the hardest question you've ever asked me, and you've asked me a lot of questions that are hard in our time talking.
Yeah.
And it's hard for two reasons. One, because what is actually like practical and correct? And two, I'm very biased towards too much data. There's no such thing to me. Give me 1,000 reports with a bunch of different numbers. If you don't color code them, I'll make my own Excel and color code them myself. So there's no such thing. But if I were to really think about this, like what would help most people in retail, simplifying a scorecard for sure. And then having scores, this is going to be like overly simplistic, but a lot of scorecards are actually a scorecard. They look like a report card, just so everyone listening
Mhm.
understands what it is in most companies. In one company, I saw something I really liked, which was they visually, not actually numerically, visually weighted the metrics by what size box they were in. So picture a piece of paper cut into, I think it was like 32 boxes, but you'd have two big boxes in the top left. And it was like sales and comp all the way to the bottom right. And in the bottom right, tiny, was like your product loss, like theft, essentially percentage. So that was like
Okay.
weighted the least in your scorecard. So basically, if your comp was good, your sales good, some of the other big metrics were good, you'd see visually more green than yellow or red. And I
Great.
thought that was the best application I've ever seen as like a quick snapshot of visually, am I doing good? Because
Right.
even if I'm not having a lot of theft and some of the other small metrics that I can't even remember because they were like really granular stuff. Even if all of that was green, but your top was red, you'd be like, oh, well, that all that green doesn't matter. So I think that was amazing. And I'm just going to steal it for this answer. But I'm going to say the biggest thing I would change, and we've said it 6,200 times, I would change turnover to be a big box on that scorecard, as big as comp, actually. And I think that
Great.
would put a lot of pressure on a lot of people to really think about turnover and why it's happening. Because again,
Yeah.
retail leaders live and die by metrics. So give us a metric that's going to make us have to really change what we're doing.
Yeah.
And then I think, and I'm just saying this because of our conversation, maybe there's a component on there that is an employee survey score or something. So it's something you have to look at with your financial score. Because that's the issue, in my opinion, too. It's not just that it's happening once a year, it's happening once a year, siloed way over here,
Hmm.
outside of financial performance. And I think if we start to move turnover and employee sentiment into financial performance, again, you're
Right.
going to start to see patterns, but two, you're going to focus on it because it's there on your scorecard, making you look good or making you look bad.
Has your performance as a store manager ever been measured according to your team's turnover rate or your employees' engagement scores?
Only in one place. Once
Wow.
again, shout out Old Navy. Old Navy has turnover reporting by position. So
Mm.
hourly, then the key holder, then that next level manager. And it's expected that the higher up the chain, the lower the turnover. They sort of expect the highest turnover to be among hourly staff. So you're rated, I forget what you're rated against. I don't know if it was an arbitrary number or like against the district. I'm not sure. I can't remember. And
Right.
then the employee engagement survey as well is like a way you're looked at. And it's meant to be like a curiosity thing. So you had to come up with a plan for your store based on your survey. And then corporate dealt with bigger patterns across the company or a region if there was one or two things. And so for my store, I'll just be really candid. It was actually that question about career growth and development, which is funny. And not funny, this isn't a critique of my staff who answered that. They clearly felt that way. Many people were promoted in my store and from my store into other bigger stores. And I think that question came down to them learning new skills, if I were to be honest. I think I was so focused on promoting people, I wasn't focused on people who were like, well, I just want to learn the other thing that I don't know. And I was like, I don't have time for you. I'm promoting this person. But Yeah, I was rated because I want shout out to me. I'm gonna give a shout out to me. I wanted like a little thing from HR because I was the only store in my territory that got 100% on the question. I enjoy the people I work with, and every single one of my 60 member team said yes.
Wow.
But so you were rated there, and not everything on that scorecard was good. I don't actually remember the bad. But yeah, Old Navy's the only one that's really, every company has measured turnover. And sometimes, though, sometimes there is such thing as good turnover. That
Sure.
team needed to go. And so that's looked at. But sometimes I think that's used as an excuse in a lot of places. Well, they just
Sure.
weren't right. Well, they just didn't like it here. And it's like, is that really the answer as to why there's 160% turnover in that store over there? Because I've heard stories about that manager. So I do think that companies measure it. It's just not always something they're actually holding someone to. Because again, that store that I just made a joke about at a company I'm not going to say, it's a real life example of 160% turnover. That store actually performed well, but only because it was in an area where there was no other business like it around. So people basically had that as an option. So because their financial results were good, they were like, well, the 160 is people can't keep up with how busy that store is. I'm like, that's not the answer, but you think that.
Cool. I want to just touch on one thing. So we're talking about turnover because it's such an important metric and it is a measurable, it's a quantifiable metric. But I could see maybe listeners being like, well, turnover is it's too late, right? So how do I reduce my turnover score? And I think, and you're welcome to answer, but I think that's ultimately what we're trying to answer with all of these episodes and with our entire business is we're talking about employee experience and employee engagement. And there's no catch-all solution to reduce turnover except make it better to work there.
Yeah. And I think the thing we've talked about this a lot, it's a theme in a lot of our conversations, theme in how I operate my life, really. But so often the solution is just honest questions and honest answers. Again, if you build that psychological safety and ask your team very frankly, again, if you've built the right culture, they'll answer these honestly. What would keep you here?
Yeah.
And then conversely, ask them, what could I do, the company do that would make you go? What's the thing that's going to make you say, screw this place, I'm out? Because in those two answers, you'll find so much that we can do at a store level, a district level, obviously a corporate level. So I think creating that place where you can get honest answers to those questions, you'll really get some interesting answers. Sometimes there are things you can't control, but it's interesting information to have.
So how could you as a store manager better communicate more nuanced qualitative success to corporate?
So I think you're going to have to be a really great storyteller, and I don't mean fiction, and start telling stories about your quantitative results that are the result of the qualitative in your store.
Right.
Which also means my biggest advice to people is, especially if you come into a new store, you're newly promoted, whatever P&L or financial report you have access to, the first month you're in the store, especially if it's a company where you can't always go back and get old reports, print that and keep it. Save it forever. Not only for yourself, but because someday someone's going to walk into your store and maybe think your results aren't good enough. And if you have that old report, you can start to, again, tell the story of, well, here's where we were and here's where we are. And I did that through building a team that trusts each other, is compassionate, or whatever the case may be that's qualitative, that's not on that report somewhere. I really think that the answer is good storytelling. I think it's a skill that every leader should learn, because without it, all they have is that scorecard. So if you can't storytell, it's going to sound, and we've all heard this, it's going to sound like you're making excuses. And the second you start to sound like you're making excuses is the second you lose respect of a corporate team. So you need to paint the picture for them. They're not going to paint it for you. They're not going to be like, oh yeah, I remember in my 200 store visits last year, I did visit this store last year and it was a shithole. And now look how great it is. They don't remember. They're too busy. So it is your job to tie all those strings together.
Got it. As we start to wrap up, what companies have you seen do this really well? And I guess by this, I mean marry qualitative and quantitative metrics to promote sustainable business growth.
So I had a great experience in a couple of companies. I don't know that I would attribute that to the companies as much as I would contribute that to my boss at the time, my bosses. And how those bosses did it was by celebrating, and actually, I can hear two leaders in my head right now Brian from Old Navy and Jake from Starbucks, both were all about celebrating the behaviors, not just the result, and like literally use that phrase. And that helps marry the two because they're celebrating what they see when they come in your store, even if they know the results are bad. And actually, I'll use the credit card thing as an example. So if you walk into my store, I have really terrible credit card acquisition. And the regional leader is like, wow, that cashier is asking every single person. They're giving all the benefits. They're saying all the right things. Great, let's celebrate that. Or I just saw someone drowning in the fitting room and another employee came and helped them without me directing it because I'm in a visit, so I can't be as hands-on. Sometimes I think that's the secret point of visits and bigger stores too, because you can't manage your team while you're in the visit. So they're just kind of doing their thing. And so seeing those things and then rewarding you, being like, wow, your team works really well together. So it's about celebrating the behaviors, even and especially, honestly, when your store has a bad metric in that area. That teaches me as a store leader that the behaviors are important, not just the results. How we get there is important. And if I know that, and then I pass it on with my team, and it's sort of this like, lovely trickle down theory that actually works. And I think for the most part, like Old Navy in a big picture was good at it because all the business partners I talked to did seem to care about how you got there. That was used a lot. And I think that is the key, is using that phrase and living that phrase, not just saying the phrase, but actually when someone comes to a visit, they really are celebrating that people are doing the right thing or your team seems happy. Like I've had people be like, wow, your team seems genuinely happy. And then they celebrate that. And then I can't remember which leader it was, but I think it was Old Navy where someone basically was like, okay, well, your results aren't where they need to be yet, but your team seems really happy to be here and excited. And that's step one. So them acknowledging that reinforces it. Because if they had come in and been like, okay, your team seems happy, but we really need to make some money. That's going to teach me a different thing about what's important and what's not. What corporate focus on is what becomes important. It doesn't matter what they say. It's what is the focus.
Yeah. I feel like this goes back to the very top of this episode where we set the frame of the goal of retail is business growth, right? We're all looking for business growth here. And I would say we talked about what does that mean? That looks like a bigger market share or a higher customer lifetime value. But I think what we're getting to the crux of is what makes it sustainable is team engagement.
Yeah, for sure.
If you are hyper-focused on the current quarter at the expense of your team, and that never stops, there's no end in sight to that unsustainable workload, you're at a point where we can't do this well, and you lose team engagement, I think you've lost the sustainable part of business growth.
For sure.
Okay. Last question for you. If you have the ear of corporate retail leaders or store managers, whoever you feel needs to hear it, if they take away one thing, what's 1 or 3 actionable things that they could do today or tomorrow at work?
I think for the corporate leaders listening, I think the answer really is getting context to the numbers. I've worked places where you basically have to like hand in a business report and kind of give some action steps. And maybe that's the answer. Instead of just action steps, you're just giving context that comes judgment free. But overall, the advice to corporate leaders is really just don't assume that you can know everything you need to know by looking at a score sheet, because you can't. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, if I could ride the coattails of that, it would be put more weight on your engagement surveys. Even if they are only once a year right now, for one, I would say find a way to shorten your feedback loop. Might be somehow through your district meetings. But even if all you have is the annual one, make it more important and don't compare yourself to the retail industry benchmarks. Aim higher. Well, I think we all need to aim higher. A rising tide raises all ships. So the status quo right now, the benchmarks aren't serving anyone. It's not sustainable. So I think we all have to try a little harder there. Matt, final thoughts?
That was a lot.
That was a lot. It always is.
My final thoughts are always going to be the same. We could end every episode with me saying it's also complicated and yet also simple.
Yeah. Amen. Because it is. It's the simple part is just talking to the people who are making the money in stores. And I think the complicated part is doing it at scale and synthesizing those answers and making meaningful change and making it fair across stores and across districts and things like that. So we recognize that it's complicated in execution. And I think that's why we're trying to be more tactical rather than make work meaningful. But how? What do I do tomorrow? Yeah, we'll continue to dig into that stuff as these episodes continue. All right. Good place to wrap it.
Yeah.
Thanks, man. Good chat.
Good chat.
You're listening to Dear Corporate, Love Stores.